It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour in the company of Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of The Daily Beast. How are you, sir?
Good. Glad to be here.
Glad to see you back in Paris.
Yes.
You were in Brussels.
A week in Brussels, yeah.
Okay. Also with us, Nicholas Vineker of Politico.eu, based out of Brussels. A lot of your correspondents caught in the thick of it.
Close to the action.
As well this week. Venezuelan photojournalist Salah Suarez joins us. Nice to see you again. And France24.com senior editor Lila Jacinto. The World This Week, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Twitter and Facebook our hashtag F24Debate. A tragic full circle, you might say, for the news cycle since we were here 7 days ago. A raid this Friday in the Schaerbeek district of Brussels. 1 week ago at this time, we were covering the arrest of Europe's most wanted fugitive in the nearby Molenbeek neighborhood, Paris attack suspect Salah Abdeslam. In between, of course, we were mentioning it, there were Tuesday's rush hour blasts that rocked the airport and a metro stop that is minutes away from the European Commission headquarters. Yes, this time it was Brussels.
Les hurlements de sirènes.
The screaming sirens, the apocalyptic images will stay with each of us forever.
En chacun de nous, comme à Paris,
like in Paris, Bamako, Ankara, Tunis,
Ankara,
and the Jewish Museum. We've been struck with brutal, stupid, blind violence.
Et méchante à frapper.
Christopher Dickey, it's almost become kind of, I hate to say this because it sounds callous, but a drill that the citizens of Brussels are going through, and that's become familiar to world audiences.
Well, maybe to world audiences, but not certainly to the people of Brussels. I mean, when you have at least 31 people killed, a couple of hundred seriously injured, 61 people I think are still in critical condition, that has a pretty massive impact on the emotions of a city and a people. And I think we also have to look at Brussels, at this attack, as another terrible attack in Europe against Europe. This is all part of a design by the so-called Islamic State to try and instigate a guerrilla war here in Europe. Now, having a few...
So this isn't nihilism lashing out at a soft target. This is part of a
No, it's part of
plan.
the plan. I mean, if you go back and you look at for instance, Abu Musab al-Suri's manifesto 11 years ago, he describes Europe as the soft underbelly of the West. And clearly, at this point, the jihadists figured that Belgium was the soft underbelly of Europe.
Nicholas Vineker?
I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, immediately after the attack, or hours, they published a video where they showed, among others, Donald Trump talking about Brussels, a hellhole, a place of violence and a horror show, and rejoicing in that kind of language. And the idea is to spread fear and division and to turn native or European populations against immigrant populations and start some kind of a civil war. And some very qualified people have stood by that assessment of their goals. Yep.
That is the goal. Salah Suarez, what was your reaction when you saw what happened on Tuesday? And again, that first bombing takes place just before 8 a.m. and it takes place not inside the airport, really, but beyond security, but at the check-in counter.
Yeah, that's something that I want to say about that, exactly, because I knew about the attacks like around 11. I was in a meeting, I was in an interview, and I lost my phone. So I was not connected. I was not aware of what was going on, meaning that this connection also lead us to be aware of everything immediately, and that's what they're looking for. I was happy walking around Paris, not knowing what was going on, and suddenly I see people on a TV and I see people running, and I understand that something happened again. We were all waiting something to be going on in the mind of these people again, but we didn't know where it was going to hit. So the feeling when I saw just a few faces running was, again, they're doing it again. And the feeling of it was in Brussels, but we feel it in, like it was in Europe. It was for all of us the same feeling that we had in Paris. And that's a terrible thing, but it means that we are all in the same boat, feeling these emotions and being in danger by this situation with the terrorism in Europe.
The photo splashed across all the front pages on Wednesday was taken by Ketevan Kardava of the Georgian news agency. The woman you see later identified as Nidhi Chapakar, a 40-year-old mother of two and airline stewardess who hails from your native Mumbai, Lila Jacinto. What did you think of this picture?
Well, there was some debate about whether, it was appropriate to use this photograph. Mercifully, the family has come out with statements that said it's just good that she's alive and she's
in hospital with a broken foot.
She's in hospital, but she survived, and this is the face of the terrorism today. But coming back to what Chris and you were saying, I'm increasingly getting the feeling that from the jihadist perspective that it's more it's kind of wrong to look at it as just Islamic State group. As you said, Abu Suri, predates Islamic State. So, from the leadership, there's a sort of centralized jihadist ideology. Today it'll be Islamic State. Tomorrow it'll be something else. But more and more, this phenomenon that we are seeing from 2014 of the attacks, I think we should start looking at them very locally. What happened in Brussels and the networks of Brussels are very much a Brussels phenomenon, as opposed to, say, the foreign fighters who come from the US. So there is a global call for jihad, but there's also a very local way that it gets activated.
And at the heart of that is the fact they were able, they're the ones who presumably coordinated the Paris attacks, and for 4 months they're able to lie low.
Yes, and also, what it shows you, alarmingly, is that you have a few operatives and, their networks can touch so many others and they can set off another thing. But if you really want to start tackling the problem as opposed to growing alarmed by it and just talking about it as a global phenomenon, you need to work on these networks. And from what has been revealed of the investigation so far, it seems like these are criminal groups of buddies, who've taken on, as we've discussed for 2 years now, they've taken on this new mantle. But in order to get a grip of it, this is not a very vast network. If you really put in the resources to try to uncover how these things work.
Well, I think that reminds me a little bit of President Obama saying it's not an existential threat. Well, the problem is that you don't need a huge network. You can have a few guys, let's say a few hundred guys. We know there are several thousand who've gone to Syria, and a lot of them have been indoctrinated, and a lot of them have come back to Europe. And not only to Molenbeek in Belgium, also to Spain, to France, all over. And we know that there are a lot of weak spots in European security, Spain being a classic example. I would expect Spain would be another target.
But the fact that this guy, Salah Abdeslam, the Europe's most wanted fugitive, is able to lie low for 4 months.
It goes back to the hood. Look, what is Molenbeek? Molenbeek is a place with 40% at least unemployment among young men, okay? It's a place where people were brought in, the previous generation was brought in to work in factories that all collapsed. They all went bankrupt. They're dead. So there's very little to do there. What do people do? What's the economy based on? Hash dealing, marijuana, and Captagon. That's what people do there. So if that's the economy, nobody talks to the police. Nobody's going to talk to the police. It's also a place where people are very conspiracy-minded. You get people on the street there telling you all the time, oh, the Paris attack, that was the Jews, that was the CIA, that was somebody, it was always somebody else. So you go back to your hood, and if people want to convince themselves of that kind of thing, they'll protect a boy from the hood. They're not gonna rat you out to the police, except somebody did rat him out, finally. And somebody, just like the cab driver, who we believe was Moroccan, who wound up taking police back to the bomb factory used by the airport
But
bombers.
do you take Lila's point that it's not such a big sell?
No, I don't, actually. I think Lila's wrong about that. I think that it doesn't take huge numbers, but I think that the Islamic State is organizing on a scale the likes of which we have never seen before. And I think they have a conscious desire and program to try and instigate warfare here. And in fact, to incite the West to engage in warfare on Syrian and Iraqi territory against them?
I would agree and disagree. If you look at some of the serious security assessments that have been made in Europe since last November, they do talk about a strategy of moving fighters back to Europe and mounting large operations. And they say there are 400 several hundred fighters who are already on European soil and planning to do these things in a fairly systematic way. If you look at the scale of security preparations that the French army has done ahead of the Euro 2016, they're preparing for massive scenarios. And I don't think they would do it if they thought these people were amateurs. Where I do agree 100% is that the failures are local and the weaknesses are local. And a place like Molenbeek is under-policed, there's too little government implication. Who would know that there's a de-radicalization program inside Molenbeek that actually boasts pretty good results? But it didn't get to these guys. And I think in a lot of different places, we talk about what you said, the hood and the enclave and these pockets of subversion within European states that we don't get to, and I think those are very dangerous, and that's where the ideology and the terrorism proliferates.
Well, and the whole point of the strategy is to get rid of the gray zone in between, to take the Muslim population and say, you have to side with us because you are going to be attacked by the non-Muslims in Europe. And they do it's like the communist revolutionaries used to talk about exacerbating the contradictions. That was exactly what they set out to do, and it's exactly what ISIS is setting out to do.
Right, but it is not true that the larger Muslim community has condones this at all. And in fact, if you look at Molenbeek, was it 2006 when a Moroccan Belgian woman wrote a book about her reporting in she got slammed at that stage because it was a socialist administration. Her community called her self-hating Arab. The lefty administration was saying that this is a bit too much. We are multicultural, etc. But you're right that the alarms have to come from the community because.
I'm not saying that the community has fallen for this strategy yet. I'm saying that's the strategy. In fact, I spent a lot of time yesterday out in the square at the Bourse in Brussels, and it was full of women in hijab, men with beards, obvious Muslims, and they were saying, "Look, this is not us," and of course it's not them. We're talking about a small, committed cadre of people who are trying to make a revolution.
But now you call them small, Chris.
It doesn't. I said that. To say that they're just a small group, the way you said it, implies it's really not a problem. Well, it really is a huge problem.
No, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but we've got to find a strategy to tackle it. And, breaking through the networks is how we're going to do it. Another thing is also now, how is Belgium going to deal with it? Because, post the November 13 attacks in France, we saw a state of emergency. They did these measures that went too far. It's such a precarious balance.
And on that point, there was a bit of cross-border finger-pointing less than 24 hours after Tuesday's blast. France's finance minister was putting the heat on his neighbors to the north.
I don't know if I should say it's Belgium in particular, but there seems to have been a belief amongst certain politicians that to allow a better integration, we should let some communities just develop on their own. Maybe this comes from being overly naive, but here in France we especially know that a republic is not formed out of the juxtaposition of different communities, but of their integration.
Sarah Suarez, what do you make of that damning indictment of multiculturalism by Michel Sapin?
Well, this is Paris has all this community that surrounds the city is a mix of all sort of nationalities, and I live in 93, and I see it every day.
The northern suburbs of Paris.
Of course, and there is people from everywhere. You see it in the metro. It's complicated because
So it's unfair, the remarks he makes.
I think because it's complicated to talk in those terms. And coming back to what you were saying, I agree fully that it is actually a bunch of people. It's a few guys, but they're very powerful. They've been trained. They have all the technology on their hands to communicate. And we're not anymore in the terrorism of the 70s. We are in this new era where you don't need massive channels of people to communicate it and send the message from here to there. You just can buy a phone for 20 euros and then throw it away and then get another one. You can't communicate so easy today. So that makes it that it's simple to be a little group and doing a massive harm to a population, to a city, and to a country.
I have to differ just a little bit on, I think what Michel Sapin was referring to, and I think everybody who talks about Molenbeek seems to be referring to the same thing, a statement by the mayor or the bourgmestre of that small area, who was asked about the fact that Salah Abdeslam had been living in a subsidized housing unit. And they said, how could it be that somebody who is the most wanted man in Europe is allowed to hold on to a subsidized housing unit? And she said, well, I'm not surprised. We have dozens and dozens of subsidized housing units in Molenbeek. And I'm sorry, there is a naivete behind that remark. And you could even say it's
like the justice minister,
it's negligence to a certain extent to say, well, what do you mean? There is no issue. You don't have a responsibility to keep track of dangerous individuals in your neighborhood, that you are just watching them go by. There is a responsibility for elected officials.
Yeah, and until at least a year ago, there was also the attitude, and it wasn't unique to Belgium. In certain countries, there was the attitude that, yeah, there's jihadists around here and they move through here, but they don't attack us. Mm-hmm. Now, if we start cracking down on them too much, maybe we'll become targets. And that was actually the thinking, and it was a real problem. Sure. And it was a real problem for the French, because France is like the #1 target, because it's at war with these guys all over Africa and the Middle East.
Security lapses in Belgium, security lapses in Europe. We'll be talking about it when we come back. You're watching The World This Week.